So good evening. Based on my thesis research, tonight I want to talk about a giant globe that was put together during the Cold War and how it was used during a specific time to promote global visualization. The title of my presentation tonight is the Rand McNally Geophysical Globe, How the Earth and Moon Were Constructed to Display Post-War Sciences. During World War II, it was quite common for Franklin Roosevelt to give fireside chats on national radio to update Americans on the war. To do this, he would ask people to refer to maps. Many believed Americans were ignorant of distance relations or the spherical nature of the world because they were used to using Mercator paper maps. A geographer named Richard Edes Harrison suggested that the worldview of Americans had to be more holistic and global because the lack of knowledge threatened national security. He created maps from different perspectives in Fortune magazine, which caused a cultural shock and a need to create a teaching tool that would reflect nation-to-nation relationships more objectively. The American public had never really seen planet Earth as it really was until 1968 when Apollo 8 sent back photos of the planet for the first time. Until then, geographers were often focused on coming up with the most objective and realistic interpretations of the world through map projections on a flat piece of paper. Four men came together in the mid-50s to create a new 6-foot globe called the Geophysical Globe. They were Kenneth Fagg, a science fiction illustrator, Sam Berman, a popular magazine caricaturist, Irwin Rice, an academic cartographer from Harvard, and Rhodes Fairbridge, a leading geologist from Columbia University. The globe aimed to show how the planet really looked from an astronaut's point of view from 10,000 miles away. These pieces were made of fiberglass, were 400 to 500 pounds, spun on a motorized stand once every 3 minutes, and had a tilt similar to Earth at 23.5 degrees. Most importantly, they were designed to de-emphasize national borders. Over 100 major institutions bought one, including public libraries, universities, planetariums, naval academies, and banks and corporate offices. Among them were the American Museum of Natural History, the Library of Congress, Adler Planetarium in Chicago, and the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller. The International Geophysical Year from 1957 to 58 involved 60 nations promoting world peace by collectively sharing and advancing Earth system science at different observation points on the planet. Around this time, the Geophysical Globe was launched to convey the latest geographical information coming from the IGY, especially from the polar regions. When Sputnik, the first ever orbiting satellite, was launched in October 1957 by the Soviet Union, the globe was purchased and used by major periodicals like Look and Life to show what the Earth looked like, how satellites would orbit it, and what this meant for the United States and its global leadership in science and technology. Sputnik began the space age and the race to reach the moon during the 60s. This led to the widespread popularity of globes in many institutions throughout the U.S., which aimed to teach children the realities of science and geography. Around this time, the largest commercial mapping company in the world, Rand McNally and Company, bought the rights to the globes and marketed them globally. In 1961, President Kennedy declared America would reach the moon by the end of the 60s. Moon cartography became important that decade as NASA sought the safest spot to land men. When Apollo 11 reached the Sea of Tranquility in '69, Rand McNally had already created a detailed giant moon globe to promote the astronauts to their families in the Apollo program. Both globes reached the public through television as they were purchased by NBC and CBS studios and used in Star Trek and the evening news with Walter Cronkite. They were also shown to the world at the Brussels World's Fair in '58, the Seattle's World Fair in '62, and New York World's Fair in '64. Another highly underappreciated field of study during the 60s was oceanography and the mapping of ocean bottoms during the 60s. There was a demand by the Navy to understand the terrain of ocean's bottoms in the case of submarine warfare, and this largely gave rise to giant globes with oceanographic detail popular throughout the 70s. Buyers had a lot of control over how the globes were presented, and often they were celebrated with pamphlets, speeches, and news coverage, as was the case of the globe presented at Geo Hall at Princeton University, or in Kalamazoo, where a new planetarium and museum were created in the early 60s. By the 80s and early 90s, the rise of computers and changes in the mapping business, Rand McNally stopped making the globes and sold away its manufacturing division. Both globes saw their cultural appeal decline as problems emerged like a lack of space to keep them on exhibit, as seen here in the Canada Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. Because of the size and shape of the pieces that make up the globe, many institutions have noted how difficult the globes were to handle, often having to use whole teams of men or forklifts to move them. In some cases, like at the University of Nevada in Reno, double doors had to be created to accommodate them, as you can see in the top right photo. The globes have also proven to wear over time, especially from human touch. Because Rand McNally no longer makes the globes, special conservatives have had to be found to recapture their look. Because mapping information changes over time, such as with the end of the Cold War, it becomes very expensive to upgrade. So why do the globes matter today, if they do at all? Historians have rarely looked at the significance of material objects from the space age and what they meant culturally. I believe that these globes remind us of where and how important ideas began to shape how we visualize the planet today. As shown here, universal ideas about interdependence, world peace, and the human relations to the environment were commonly communicated through these globes following the aftermath of World War II and before space photography. Still, it is commonly held that the NASA pale blue dot photograph from Apollo 17 in 1972 presented the first visualization of Earth, and so gave rise to the environmental movement, especially through popular figures like Carl Sagan and Al Gore. I've tried to demonstrate in my presentation that post-war mapping needs and the rise of the physical science through the globe gave rise to these ideas first.